From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And a good morning to you. Welcome to Sunday Edition. This week, we're going to be talking with the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics, Jason Perry, about the hot button issue, especially back in Washington, D.C., of the indictment, second indictment, against former President Donald Trump. Then we'll sit down with a notable church historian, Richard Turley, about his new book on the aftermath of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But first, I'm very pleased to be joined by our Lieutenant Governor, Deidre Henderson. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Doug.
The reason we're gathering this morning is to talk about the special election that is coming up in the state of Utah, a special session of the Utah State Legislature. Not long ago, you were part of that. Tell us what happened on Capitol Hill, what had to be accommodated.
Well, first of all, we've got a member of Congress, Congressman Chris Stewart, who has decided that it's best for him and his family if he steps away from his seat, and he will step away in September. And what that did was it ignited the process by which the state can select a new member of Congress in the middle of a term. So we will have a special election for the 2nd Congressional District to fill that seat, and that will happen this fall. Now, there were a lot of ways that we could go about doing that. None of the options were ideal, but I think what we have finally landed on and what the legislature passed last week is the best of all of the options, and that is to move the municipal primary. So we're pushing them back a few weeks, and we will hold that special election in conjunction with those new dates for the municipal elections.
Doesn't that basically really make sense? I didn't know if there were any things that hoops we had to jump through in order to make that happen that were spectacular, but to hold 2 elections so close, first of all, could the system even handle that?
No, our system could not handle 2 simultaneous overlapping elections on different dates. It's just not set up for something like that. We want to make sure that the voters have their voices heard and their votes count accurately. So we couldn't pull off this new special election in time for the municipal primaries that were scheduled for August. So we pushed those primaries back to September 5th. It's the day after Labor Day, and we'll push the general election, and this is unprecedented, push that general election into the middle of November, November 21st. So for everybody who has to vote in a city or town election, for your mayor or city council member, statewide, whether or not you're in Congressional District 2, that election will be on November 21st now.
I can't ever recall a main election, I won't say a general election, because you kind of have to be in the presidential year or the congressional every 2-year cycle, but to not vote on that second Tuesday seems really unusual.
Well, it's very unusual, and during even-numbered years, so in 2024 or 2022, the Constitution requires that we hold those elections on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
After the first Monday is what hangs us up.
Right, exactly, yeah. Exactly. So that's in our federal Constitution and our state Constitution. But in odd-numbered years for municipal elections, there's no such requirement. It's just in statute. So we were able to, propose this to the legislature, and they agreed, and last Wednesday they met in special session and changed the law to be able to accommodate this.
Let's talk about what that has meant for those who would like to step into the seat of our 2nd District Congressman Chris Stewart. I understand a lot of people. I read a lot of the names. I know many of these individuals. We have former legislators, former candidates, former speakers of the House. Many Democrats are stepping up and so on. How is that accommodated now? Is it just like a normal, traditional primary would be?
Well, it's an accelerated process. So there is a signature path and there is a convention path. And you can choose one or the other or both. Many candidates have opted for both. But they have a 4-week window to gather signatures. So July 5th is the deadline for anyone who wants to gather signatures, who has already declared their intent to gather signatures. That's the date that they have to submit their signatures by. And the party has until that date, any party has until that date to forward the name of their nominee as well.
Right. In a congressional district, since you're dealing with basically 1/4 of the population of the state, the mark isn't quite as high as if you're trying to get signatures to run for governor or your seat of lieutenant governor or attorney general and so on. Right. Ballpark, I mean, how many signatures does somebody have to gather for the congressional race?
they have to get 7,000 signatures.
That's still an uphill job.
Yes, it is. In 4 weeks, it costs a lot of money. I've heard some candidates are going to be spending upwards of $175,000 to $200,000 on gathering signatures. Others are trying to do it with volunteers. Right. It's a high bar, and it's a pretty fast process. So the party conventions will be over by July 5th. The Republican Party is going to be, well, I think both the Republican and the Democrat Party will be over well before then. And then those signatures are due on July 5th. And then whatever happens, if we have signature gathering candidates that qualify for the ballot, there will be a primary election, like I mentioned, on September 5th.
Right. Lieutenant Governor, as far as the traditional, well, it's become traditional to get our ballots by mail, still have a few other options out there. Will that roughly be the same? Yes.
And that's why we needed at least 90 days to be able to pull off a primary election. I believe we had 76 or 77 days when Chris Stewart notified the governor that he would be stepping away. So it was not enough time to have that primary election in August. So we have to mail these ballots to our overseas and military voters 45 days before an election.
Right.
There's ballot proofing and printing. So there's a lot of things that we have to put in place before we can just send out those ballots in the mail. And in Utah, per state law, all active registered voters will get a ballot. And of course, in the primary, it depends on what party you've declared for. You'll get a ballot in the mail, but there's also opportunities for people who prefer to vote in person or for whatever reason want to. They've lost their ballot or they hadn't registered to vote or they moved to be able to go and vote in person.
Is there any fundamental change from, we've been through this before, when Jason Chaffetz stepped down, and we went through the process that ultimately gave us John Curtis. Has anything of substance changed?
A lot of substance has changed, actually, which is why we went through the process that we went through the last couple of weeks. When Jason Chaffetz stepped away, there wasn't actually a process in place. And it caused some contention. I mean, it was just very vague in statute that said that the governor will determine, I'm not going to quote it correctly, but something about the governor determining, you know, what kind of an election was going to be having and what that process looked like. Well, the legislature didn't like the governor having so much discretion, although that was what was in statute at the time. And so there was a bit of contention. And what happened in the aftermath of that a couple of years ago was this new law was created that gave the governor some guardrails and some flexibility, but that flexibility has to come with the buy-in of the legislature.
Right. It's interesting, when Olene Walker ascended from being lieutenant governor to governor, there were some questions that were opened, and again the legislature stepped in and made it a much smoother process when Gary Herbert became the governor of the state. Lieutenant Governor, what a pleasure to have you with us here on Sunday Edition.
Thanks, Doug.
And good luck on the upcoming election.
Thank you.
That, after all, is one of her big responsibilities, making sure that the elections run well and fairly here in the state of Utah. We're going to be right back. We'll talk about the second indictment of the former president of the United States and how it's impacting this year's president or 2024 presidential campaign. And we're back with the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics, my friend Jason Perry. Thank you for joining us once again. I so appreciate being able to tap into your expertise, and we're seeing things that we've never seen before.
Unprecedented. Who could even believe it?
Not only a candidate for the presidency indicted twice, but a former president of the United States indicted twice. What is your take on this? And everybody, whether it's Greg Skordas, I was listening to him on KSL Radio a little while back as kind of their legal analysis, and he said, this is so much more than we thought it was going to be, and much more specific than we thought it would be, and much more, at least within the indictment, substantiated than they thought it would be.
Yeah, a lot of people are prone right now to start say this is just this is just a political witch hunt of sorts. It's kind of weaponizing the Department of Justice. You hear all those things, but when you see an indictment, what just came down and the detail that went into it, it's more than just theater, which is what's so interesting about what might happen next. And people don't know, this is unprecedented. These kinds of activities are things that would have really kind of brought down elected officials in the past, but not him. And there's a couple of good ideas that I have about why that might be the case, but really up to the American public as they look at this and say, look at the details and then make a decision.
There's some very recent polls that still showed him on the Republican side of the aisle just leading it all, leading the herd.
Yeah, it's true. So, and you look at the state of Utah, because we've done some polling there, about 60% of Utahns feel like the charges were politically motivated. But once you put that layer on top of it, and you say, well, what kind of support does President Trump has? He is not outpacing others, Ron DeSantis in particular. Among Republicans, it's 26, 27% in our last poll. So it's not like he's been able to really go too far beyond DeSantis. So that says something about where Utahns are. But nationally, most of these polls happened right before the indictment came down. So we're going to see what happens over the next 2 weeks.
You know, the presidents have been in trouble before, and we won't go into ancient history, but in my lifetime, we've had President Clinton, we have had President Trump, of course, with you know, the full but not in, you know, not found guilty in impeachment. But even George W. Bush, you know, along with Cheney and Rumsfeld, they actually were tried by a tribunal in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and were, you know, found guilty of war crimes, but of course it had no international standing at all. Going back, Richard Nixon, of course, and before my time, you know, Warren G. Harding. But I was reading an article about that, and there was something that just jumped off the page. And they talk about famous people from politicals, you know, have political history, you know, Richard Nixon and so on. But they said this is from a different era, when politics was a more serious business for more serious people. Are we to the point where it's like World Wrestling Federation, where we're just looking for people to whack each other with chairs?
Well, that's a pretty interesting quote right there, because it does appear to be more theater now. It's more positioning and posturing than it is about policy, and that's a concerning trend without question. You know, and I think we have to get back to that period of time where it was more serious. I mean, you ever think there'd be a day when a former president is indicted and gets on a plane and goes to a fundraiser?
I know.
You know,
I know.
And uses everything that just happened sort of as a prop for what happens next. And you know, it's happened on both sides, are using these as fundraising opportunities, and it is less serious, more show, and that's more concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you anticipate as we get closer and closer now? Things are ramping up. We've got the municipal elections coming up this fall, and it's a little unique in Utah because of our congressional seat being open. But then it's just full bore, pedal to the metal, presidential race 2024. What are you anticipating?
Well, I think that these controversies are not going to go away, and they're going to really start to have an impact. But we'll start to see what segments of our population are looking at what. Keep in mind, President Trump, for running for president, he doesn't need everyone.
Yeah.
He needs his 30%. He needs just maybe 35%. And what I'm going to be watching as it does go all in, as we start, you know, getting the airwaves slammed, is to what impact. Some of these candidates, when there's a bunch, you have this plurality issue, and they're all looking for that same 30 or 35%. And so, you know, one might say, you know, what's going to happen because of these indictments? Will this hurt President Trump? Well, it didn't so much before.
That's right.
And he doesn't need everyone. And there is a group of people who are going to stand by him. And so we'll see to what impact that has on the other candidates, like a DeSantis or someone else who at least has some of the higher numbers, to see if our people are willing to start changing.
Is the Republican Party at some point, and right now the shoe's on the Republican Party's feet, but is it going to have to do a little house cleaning and kind of mop the floors a bit?
Yeah. I think that discussion, based on my conversations, is already happening. There's an effort to appeal to some of those younger voters, how to take away some of the antics that they have seen and get back to core policy. And I think that's where the Republicans, maybe in the state, but also across the country, has sort of lost that messaging. Because people may agree with them on some of these core policies, the core positions of the party, but that's being hijacked by a lot of other things. And I know in my conversations with Republican Party leaders, they're trying to reclaim that narrative. A little less about the show, a little more about the core. And I think that's what they're going to have to do nationwide, and definitely here in the state of Utah.
Maybe back to the more serious business for people that are serious about politics.
Right.
Yeah. Jason, thank you so much for your friendship. Thank you for being part of the program. We're kind of becoming at the end of my tenure on Sunday Edition. You've been a big part of it. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, and for enriching us all for so very long and keeping us all engaged.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you so much. And stay with us. A church historian and author, another good friend of mine, Richard Turley, will be joining us on a groundbreaking new book. Stay with us. And thank you for being part of today's program. I'm here with a friend, Richard Turley, who just released the long-awaited follow-up to his groundbreaking 2008 book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows. And I would assume that the most frequently asked question that you have had over now a decade and a half is, and I've asked my fair share, when will this book finally be out?
It's a question I've heard very frequently.
Yeah, and here it is. Here it is. You know, we mentioned your authorship and your hard work now for decades, not years. We're talking decades. But others have been involved too. And this time we have Barbara Jones-Brown, who worked with you, along with others. And the one thing that I've so appreciated in your work and those who have worked on this project is how many people, going back to Juanita Brooks and so on, have really been immersed in this very project.
So we're grateful that there's been a renaissance of studies on the Mountain Meadows Massacre since Juanita Brooks to the present time. And we've been benefited in that we've been able to find more information than any previous authors have been able to find, in part because we had good backing from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We were able to get information from 31 of the 50 U.S. states and 3 of the National Archives facilities. Altogether, it amounted to about 50 linear feet of files just for this book and its predecessor.
I was mentioning to you as we were walking onto the set today, I've read quite a few books on this and have really appreciated our conversations, but I don't think it's ever been so appropriately laid out. The perfect storms that were unfolding. You have mentioned over and over, this isn't just a Utah book. This isn't just a book about Mormonism. It's a national story in every sense of that word.
It's a story that brings to bear not only the people in Utah that are familiar names to folks who live here, but also Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, John Wesley Powell, Sam Houston, major national figures.
You know, I happen to have the book, and our crew in the control room has asked that I hold it up, and it's called Vengeance Is Mine, the Mountain Meadow Massacre and its Aftermath. And I'll tell you, I got a real interesting insight. Something else I mentioned to you. Many of us who have been familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have read innumerable books on Brigham Young and have heard innumerable stories. But again, just within your narrative here, I learned a lot about Brigham Young and the ongoing question that's been asked since the massacre itself occurred. What was his involvement? To what degree was he aware? Did he order it? And so on. Tell us a little bit about Brigham Young's involvement.
When we started this project, it was our goal to let the chips fall where they may, regardless of who they hit, including Brigham Young. As we went through and analyzed all the information, it became clear to us that Brigham Young did not order the massacre. Now, the massacre took place, as many mass killings do, in a time of war. And certainly Brigham Young was responsible for the rhetoric that he used during this time of war. And that rhetoric, of course, created excitement in people. But you could say that as well about the President of the United States at the time, James Buchanan. Leaders who work together and sometimes work against each other often have rhetoric that causes their followers to go further than they might have gone. That's been true of virtually every war in the history of the world. But Brigham Young also was concerned about not spilling innocent blood. He said in his journal that he wanted to be certain that he was not responsible for injuring the innocent, and that in this war, before anybody was attacked, he wanted to be certain that they'd been warned and given a chance to go elsewhere.
One thing that comes up over and over in the book is that Brigham Young said, when we can have a fair court, and I will basically do whatever it takes. You want me to go to Parowan? You want to have it up here? You want to go there? Whatever. But as long as the U.S. troops aren't surrounding the courthouse or something like that, I will be the one to help make it happen. There's a quote here that I really liked. He's being interviewed in 1866. by some fairly high-ranking soldiers. And he said that he believed the matter has left us in an unsettled condition, reflects evil on me no matter how unjustly. And he went on to say he anxiously desired the matter thoroughly cleared up and investigated, went on to say if there were Mormons guilty in that act, it was one of the most dastardly things that ever occurred, and let them be brought to justice. Were they? John D. Lee certainly was.
Brigham Young had been saying that since 1859, when he became more and more aware of what had actually happened down there. He wanted it investigated. He wanted it taken care of in the federal courts, not his local courts. And he wanted to make certain that those responsible paid for it. Now, ultimately, there are 9 people who were indicted for their roles in the massacre. 5 of them are arrested. And of those 5 who were arrested, there are really 3 who were key. There are 2 others who were key that never were arrested. The 3 who were key were William Dame, the senior military leader in southern Utah, who was the highest ranking person to give the authority to carry out the massacre. The second one was John D. Lee, who negotiated with the victims under a white flag, promising them protection, and then was responsible for, along with dozens of others, for their deaths. And then the third one was Philip Klingensmith, who was also on the ground and participated in the massacre. Philip Klingensmith had already agreed to turn state's evidence, so they tried to turn John D. Lee against William Dame by having him turn state's evidence. They offered him a plea deal. They said, if you will give us good information, then you can walk and we'll go after William Dame. As it turned out, John D. Lee didn't give them enough information to prosecute William Dame, so at that point they said, we're going to go after Lee. So Lee ends up being the only one who is fully prosecuted and executed. Mm-hmm. There were probably 6 people who were responsible for the massacre in one way or another. If you go on with that quotation from 1866, what you see is that the military officer talking to Brigham Young, who said, I want these people punished, this military officer says to Brigham Young, well, even if they're not punished on earth, they'll be punished in the next life. And Brigham Young says that is certainly true.
I so wish we had more time. Rick, you've been a great friend, and as you know, I'm retiring on July 1st. This is the last interview we will have on this program, but Vengeance is Mine. This is part 2 of what you started in 2008. It's available now almost everywhere, and I so appreciate the book. I appreciate your friendship. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful retirement.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Sunday Edition. Join us again next week for what will indeed be my last episode of Sunday Edition, and the handoff to our new host, that will be Boyd Matheson. Thank you. Music and the Spoken Word is coming up next.